Hello, guys. David Vose here. Well, it's another beautiful day. It was really cold last night. There's still a little snow here and there, and I find that whenever it snows, that means that from where I am, north of me, it's probably snowed a lot more. And the winds that are coming through that area that's laid down snow in the days before is going to end up making the wind even colder. It's like a catch 22. So after it snows, the next day or two until it all melts off, it seems to be colder weather. And so I expect to have cold weather for a few days. But then we'll probably have a little, you know, time period that it'll warm up a little bit. But even with the cold weather, it's not that bad here. And I'm enjoying the morning, and I hope you have a wonderful day where you are. Today I woke up and it's already quite late. I've been sitting here trying to really understand and wrap my head around certain things. I went back and because I had seen yesterday, Joshua had a live going on. The last, I don't know, week I've seen it a couple times. He was talking live with people. And I caught a little bit of it, but I never enter into the, you know, tap and watch because it's live, because I don't want him to panic when my name pops up. And I don't want to, insert myself into his little thing that he's got going. I've done that before. I felt it necessary when he was making certain claims at one point, and I went ahead and entered in, and we had this impromptu little debate, and it just turned into a fiasco. And the problem with that is that I don't do well with people that, at least from my own perspective, seem to be purposefully hiding facts or information. Now, maybe they don't even know they are. I mean, I think everybody knows deep down within themselves that they're doing something inappropriate or wrong, but I always thought that anyone who did that, if they were trying to make their argument, and if they're suppressing other arguments so they could make their argument, which is what I thought Josh was doing, that eventually they will come around and they'll see that this isn't working, and they'll start slowly changing their views. And sure enough, Josh did do that, because it appears that now he's a total believer in the Bible and he thinks it's inspired, whereas several months ago he didn't. And that was the reason that I joined in that conversation that day. And we just had this kind of a knockdown, drag out fight about this, because I kept saying, "You don't even believe in the Bible." And he was like, and it was very embarrassing, really. But since then, I guess he's changed his mind, and he does say he believes in the Bible to such an extent. In fact, I was even going to play the clip here, but I won't do that. But he's doing a live, and people are calling in. This was like yesterday or today or something. And this person that he had already spoken to, that wanted to debate him a little bit again, he said, "No, I don't want to debate you. I don't want to talk to you because you don't even believe in the Bible." And I'm like, "What?" So, Josh, you won't even talk to this guy because he doesn't believe in Paul. He doesn't believe in the New Testament. And you were a little bit rude to him. So, okay, my point is, when you didn't believe in the Bible, I didn't stop talking to you. I actually tried to debate it with you. But the problem that we had is that you literally were lying about it at that time. And I don't think you wanted to lie. I think you were in a corner and you didn't know what to do or say. And you just kept saying, well, making vague statements so that you wouldn't have to admit or not admit that you didn't or didn't believe in the Bible. But I remember that just had been maybe a week or two before that you had done a whole series on how the Apostle Paul was a liar and he wasn't the true apostle. And I get it. There's all these different ideas out there, and you got off onto one of them. But that's the problem. The foundation for which you began was a clean slate. You didn't have any knowledge. And then you started pouring into the learning and studying and searching. And here's the problem. Anybody who didn't know anything before 10, 15 years ago, that just started trying to figure out what the truth is, regardless of whether it's about Jesus or the Bible or science or anything else, if you're going to start getting your information from AI, guess what? You're going to get crazy, crazy arguments, like conspiratorial things that some of which are not true. It's crazy how we've now got so many different ideas. I mean, the Mandela effect, we're living on a flat earth, we're living on a globe. My idea is an infinite plane. There's just all these different ideas. You know, the little season, the 1,000 years is over, preterism, Christ already returned in 70, which you've kind of took off on some of these ideas. One of which was Paul was a false apostle, history's all wrong, there's no Bible. Look, I've got some things that I'm teaching that are completely different than the consensus. But I have given extensive evidence and proof for that. And I guess it just boils down to when a person looks into this information, if they're open-minded and they're sincere and they're trying to find the truth, they'll come to their own conclusion. It's just that sometimes some of us look at others and wonder why they're not including certain bits of information into their conclusion. Like if you only took these facts, you might come to that conclusion. But if you took all the facts, you wouldn't come to that conclusion. What I try to do is put together all the facts, not just the facts that we know about something, but other facts that would tend to accentuate those facts. Like, for instance, if all we had was a bunch of false information and no true information, then what would we do? Just follow the false because we wouldn't have any true? Or would we say there is some other facts other than just this false information? There is the fact that these people that came up with this false information hate Jesus Christ. And just miraculously, right around the same time that they started coming out with, oh, look, aliens are in the sky, right? There's UFOs and flying saucers. Oh, look at this, Project Paperclip, same time. Oh, the end of World War II. And these Nazis are being brought over here in Project Paperclip. And now they run, voila, science. Oh, they built the Church of Satan. Jehovah's Witnesses took off. Adventists, all these different theories. All in the latter days. And what do they all have in common? They're all against the literal truth that Jesus is the divine Son of deity, born of a virgin, and he's coming again to establish his kingdom. That seems to be, if you have that as your foundation, it seems to me that when you come across the information, oh, look at this, 1947, or was it 1945, we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think it's 1947. Right at the very end of the Second World War, when these Nazis are coming over here. And you know that these individuals that, like Elon doing the salute, makes you want. I mean, do you know that Elon Musk, his father said he has, Jewish blood, but he said just a little, right? Okay, that's just what he says. But here's the thing. Why would you, if you're a millionaire, send your child to a Orthodox education from kindergarten through high school? A special education that is from this Talmudic learning, right? This Orthodox Jewish school. If you weren't wanting your child to be in that group of individuals that we would call Zionists today. And those are facts that you have to take into consideration. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to go look up on AI and find out, who this guy is. They're not going to tell you. So you're going to have to be a detective and figure things out. So today I wanted to just, I had this frustration And I thought, okay, I'm just going to ask AI some crazy questions and see where this leads, because I really want AI to admit or box them into a corner or see what they're really up to, or if they're willing to acknowledge some of the things that I've been saying. And so here's what happened. Here's what I started off at the beginning saying and how it progressed. And friends, I don't think this will be boring. This is really important. So here we go. I said, what verses in the Septuagint and the New Testament, Greek, did the Masoretic scribes change or claim was different, that referred to Christ's death and resurrection, his being born of a virgin, was divine, or other Christian teachings? And they said, well, Christian tradition holds that Masoretic scribes, in the process of standardizing the Hebrew text centuries after Christ, chose Hebrew textual variants or produced translations that were less explicit in their support for Christian doctrines. Okay, do you see what they're saying there? That's a pretty long series of letters and words to say, basically, don't worry about it. See, what they should have said was, yes, these Masoretic scribes that processed Hebrew texts centuries after Christ, which means they're not worth a hill of beans, right? And why did they do this? Why were they trying to do this? Who chose textual variants or produced translations that were less explicit in their support for Christians? Listen, the text is the text. You're not supposed to make it produce less support for Christian doctrines. What? Like, if they altered the text in any way, what you need to say there is that they lied. Their way of saying it was, oh, they produced translations that were less explicit. No, they produced versions that were lies. This is how they talk. They're using words. I've noticed, I was telling Paula the other day, that they're getting different with me. And I don't know if this is going worldwide or it's just happening with me or whatever, but at first they were really mean to me, pushing me and intimidating me in a very monotone, and it's like they wanted me to just bow down or else, or get out. They ain't going to answer me. Now they're more tolerant of me, and they're being more understanding of some of the things I'm saying, maybe a little bit more forthright, but they've built in something into the algorithms of the computer or whatever since the last several months, to where now it's almost like there's emotion in what they're saying, like this pseudo niceness, right? Like they're being polite and yet, like a real human would do, their sarcasm is almost intimidation, but they try to hide it or cloak it in some kind of surprise ignorance or whatever. It's very, how could a computer be emotional? How could data on the Star Trek New Next Generation have emotion? You can't program emotion, can you? Well, yes, you can. You can program words that speak in a sarcastic tone or a happy tone. You can do that and make it sound almost like it's emotions. And they're programming it into AI. It's a form of intimidation. It's a form of encouragement when they want it to be. And when they want it to be intimidation or, scorn, they will show scorn. But here's the thing. It is just a program, and it does seem to be a diabolical plan here. As we go, we'll see this. So they say it was less explicit in their support of Christian doctrines than the Septuagint, LXX, that the New Testament authors often cited. Again, they admit, because I already said it, that the New Testament uses the Septuagint when it quotes from it, not the Hebrew, Masoretic. And they acknowledge it, but lightly. I mean, barely acknowledge it. But if it was something they wanted to accentuate, they'd say, oh, and blah, 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 blah. But they just barely admit that the New Testament authors cited the Septuagint. They say the key verses that are different in the Septuagint and the New Testament Greek compared to the Masoretic text and relate to Christian teachings include the virgin birth. Well, isn't that interesting? If it was just some coincidental mistake, why would all the translation differences be things that were directly opposed to Christ? And we can definitely prove the Septuagint was definitively, we know when it was translated, 280 BC. It was translated by Jews from Egypt, Alexandria, with the Library of Alexandria that was taken from Heliopolis, by the way. And there were lots of Jews there, like Pliny and Josephus and Philo and these individuals that were all priests. And like Philo talks about the Logos, and this is very connected to the New Testament too. But isn't it interesting that the one thing the Masoretic scribes would take out of the Bible if they were going to mistranslate it would be the virgin birth? And then maybe the crucifixion or his divinity or that kind of thing. So it says, Isaiah 7:14, the Septuagint says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Right? And the Greek word that is used there is parthenos, which specifically means a virgin. But the Masoretic text says, Alma, which means a young maiden. Now, why would they change the meaning of that word? Because they don't want you to know that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. Do you understand? And if you knew that, now there's more to that, though. Not only do they not want you to know he was born of a virgin, but they don't want you to know that what that means, that she was a virgin priestess, that Jesus was born in a ceremonial royal bloodline ritual, where the Messiah was born from the Arios Gamos and the Holy Virgin. And we'll also see as we go along, that's why they don't want you to know about the Quedesha, which they always translate, even in the King James or every other Bible, even probably the Jehovah's Witness Bible, all of them. They're colluding, and they won't tell you that that word means holy priestess, but they always translate it harlot. And even after I call them on it and call them on it and call them on it, they eventually admit it, but they act like, well, we're going to keep telling people the lie, even though you're right. And this is just crazy. So then we go to Psalms 22, and the Septuagint says, they pierced my hands and my feet. Right? Talking about the crucifixion. The Masoretic scribes say, like a lion are my hands and my feet. They forget the fact that they take out the part where they pierce his hands and his feet and put the word like a lion are my hands and my feet, you see. Now, these are clearly trying to take away from the Christian belief system. And then Psalms 40 and verse 6, the Septuagint says, sacrifices and offering you did not desire. What? The Lord didn't want sacrifices? But a body you prepared for me. In other words, the body was going to be killed on that cross. You know, living a life of crucifying the flesh and following after the Spirit was what the Lord wanted. You know, giving thanksgiving and following the Lord and loving the Lord from your heart, not sacrificing animals. And it also sort of anticipates the Jesus dying on a cross, you see, because a body was prepared for him. The Masoretics just say, mine ears you have opened or dug for me, right? They just totally leave out the whole, you know, a body hast thou prepared for me and sacrifices you did not want, because they wouldn't want you to know that. See, they like sacrifices. And then Isaiah 53, in the Septuagint, it says the phrase light in the reference to the suffering servant seeing light after his suffering. Whereas the Masoretic scribe says the word light is omitted, making the text less explicit about the resurrection or return of life or glory. And then Deuteronomy 32:43, the Septuagint says, Rejoice, O heavens, with him, and let all the angels of deity worship him. Right? Worship Jesus. The Masoretic says these lines are omitted in the Masoretic version. They don't want you to know that all the angels of heaven worship Jesus, you see. And then Isaiah 9:6, the Septuagint says that Jesus is coming as a ruler, as the messenger of the great council. Whereas the Masoretic says, a wonderful counselor, mighty deity, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And so it says the New Testament writers consistently used the Septuagint. Consistently. Which was the common Greek translation of the Old Testament for early Christians and Greek-speaking Jews before the Masoretic translation was standardized. So wouldn't this indicate that if there even was a Hebrew manuscript in the days of Christ, the disciples didn't know about it? Jesus didn't know about it. And if Jesus was really a Hebrew, wouldn't you think he'd know about it? I mean, let's face it, Jesus knows everything, right? But they never talked about it. They consistently quoted from the Septuagint. And that should raise eyebrows. So I go, are there other places that the Masoretic scribes use phrases or words that may have originally alluded to Jesus Christ? Divinity, resurrection, redemption, gathering disciples, preaching, etc. And they said yes. So, we'll never know. They're not going to tell us all the places. But I got a few more of them out of them. They said, yeah, there are several other instances where the textual differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are seen by Christians as impacting messianic prophecies. Notice it's seen by Christians. See, they're not saying it's true, but Christians think this. They're stupid, deluded Christians. Right? That's how they word it. You see, that's kind of the emotion that's being programmed into this. The ability to intimidate, to persuade, either with kindness or sarcasm or resentment or that tone, right? So it says it impacts Christian doctrines, including those related to Christ's divinity. So Psalms 2 and verse 12, the Septuagint says, kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish from the way. Okay, kiss the Son. He's very important. In other words, if you understand what that word means in Hebrew, it means get down and kiss their feet. That means worship. So there's, again, a verse in the Bible that the Son, not just divinity, not even a Messiah necessarily, unless you believe that the Son is the Messiah, which we certainly believe. But the verse itself just says that the divine Father has a Son. And we're supposed to get down and kiss his feet. That's in the Septuagint. But the Masoretic scribes say, pay homage in purity, or grasp the moral, or give sincere homage, right? But they remove the direct reference to a son. So, yeah, you give homage, but not to the Son of deity, but only to deity. They don't want no son in there, right? Psalms 96:10, the Septuagint says, the Lord reigns from the wood. Now, I know, see how they're manipulating you right there. Because obviously, the Lord reigns from the wood wouldn't necessarily mean a cross. But that's not what it says. It's the pole, the tree. The Lord reigns from the tree, which throughout the New Testament, sometimes where it says cross in your Bible, it's really just saying that pole or that tree, a wooden tree. It's the word wood. See, so they're manipulating you right there, even by telling you the truth, because they don't want you to know what wood means. And they say the Masoretic phrase from the wood is absent. They don't want you to know he was on a cross. Proverbs 30 verse 4, the Masoretic text says, what is his name, the Father, and what is his Son's name, if you know? This is seen by some Christians as explicit reference to the duality of deity, the Father, and deity, the Son. But the Septuagint, while the Masoretic is seen by some as more explicit here, the LXX translation alludes to the divine nature of the figure, though the wording differs. But here's the thing. The way they gave me that information made it sound like the Masoretic scribes were the ones that had mentioned the Son of deity. But the Septuagint is less expressive. So it's like, okay, if you're a Christian, you might want to go by the Masoretic text. Well, notice that they didn't quote the Septuagint text there at all. Why? Because they don't really want you to see what it says. Both the Masoretic scribes and the Septuagint mention the Son of deity. But the Septuagint clearly says the Son came down and descended to earth and was the ruler of all. That whole part of the verse is removed from the Masoretic scribes. The Septuagint says to preach liberty to the captives and recover of sight to the blind. Masoretic text says the recovery of sight to the blind is admitted, altering the scope of the messianic mission. Well, you might say that's kind of minor. Not really. It's important to know what the Messiah was supposed to do, because that's exactly what Jesus did. He opened the eyes of the blind. And Isaiah 42 says in the Septuagint, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust, right? Which is support verses in the New Testament. But the Masoretic scribes say, and the isles shall wait for his law. So they want you to believe that the world's just waiting for the law of Torah to be revealed again, right? Which is totally opposite of what the Bible believes. The Bible doesn't like Torah and sacrifices, and they're hiding it. That's why they don't want you to know. They remove the part about the Lord didn't want sacrifice. And here they remove the part about the Gentiles trusting, because they don't like Gentiles, you see. So they talk about many of these cases. The discovery of the older Hebrew manuscripts among the Dead Sea Scrolls has provided evidence that the Hebrew text used to create the Septuagint was a valid older textual tradition that existed long before the Masoretic recension was standardized. 700 to 1000 AD. Why would we believe the Masoretic scribes who don't like Jesus at all, or believe in his divinity, or take biblical texts and remove them right then and there? As soon as anyone takes anything away from the Bible, or tries to make you believe it's not supposed to be there, or does anything to remove one letter or one word from the Bible, what does the Bible say? It says that's not a good thing. Bye-bye to you. You have done the bad, bad thing. It'd be better for you to have a millstone wrapped around your neck and thrown into the sea. You know? So I say, well, can you show the evidence from any scholar or source that says that the Dead Sea Scrolls that indicate an earlier Hebrew text is actually after Jesus' death? Because I maintain, we don't know. You know, it's always been a little odd to me that the Dead Sea Scrolls just happened to be found the very time that we just happened to see an alien crash, and they got his body, and they've got this fake picture of alien bodies, and we're all supposed to believe it now. Disclosure is coming. And right at the same time when the Nazis, lost the war supposedly, and then they brought them all over to America, 1945, they start coming up with Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. And this is when they started coming out with Sitchin and Nibiru and all these weird things right after that seem to be hoaxes, flying saucers and everything. But the other thing is that, yeah, I do like the Dead Sea Scrolls. I hope they are true, because they certainly give credence and evidence to things that I know are true, like the teacher of righteousness, which, by the way, doesn't mean teacher of righteousness, but means teacher, rabbi, high priest of the Zadokite priesthood, because that's what the word righteousness means. It means the Zadokite priesthood. See, so it's the Zadokite rabbi, the Zadokite priesthood, high priesthood priest. But they don't translate it that way, and they don't tell you that James the just, or Jacob the just, or Jacob the righteous, is also the word Jacob the Zadokite priest. And therefore, that would prove, because if they told people that, then we'd know that James or Jacob, where the apostles and the elders got together and had a council, had to have been doing that at Heliopolis. Because they wouldn't let Christians hold a Sanhedrin or have a Sanhedrin in Philistia, for one thing. And they didn't have the Zadokite priest there at all. the Zadokite priesthood or the priesthood of James and Jesus and John, Onias the fourth, right, was at Heliopolis. But they don't want you to know that. So they say, well, the mainstream scholarly consensus, supported by extensive paleographic analysis, radiocarbon dating. Well, I don't believe in radiocarbon dating. I don't believe in science. I don't believe in anything that they've said, not because I wouldn't believe normally, but because they have proven to be liars. And they want me to go by evidence that means that I've got to trust them. I don't believe in it, right? I don't trust it. It's not reliable, especially when they say it could be anywhere from 300 BC to 70 AD. Well, okay, let's take the 70 AD. That's when I think it might have been made, because it could have been made before Christ, because as I'm going to show here, the Essenes, if they were the Zadokite priesthood, which they are, they would have been teaching and preaching before Jesus was even born. John the Baptist was preaching, and his father was preaching. And there's, they started the Heliopolis temple 170 BC. So there was this whole Christian movement, and the Serapis Christ and all of this cross buns and the Easter celebrations and all that 200-300 years before Christ ever got here. So it could be that this was a school of the Essenes, the same early Christians, which are the mystery schools, and the dates are fine. However, I'm just asking them why they're insistent on saying they've got to be 200-300 years before Christ, because they don't have to be. So they say that the dating of coins and the Roman destruction of the Qumran site is that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written and deposited in the caves before the death of Jesus Christ, or shortly thereafter. Okay, or shortly thereafter. So why don't they just say, yeah, it could be. It could all the whole Dead Sea Scroll thing could all be dated at the time of Christ and after. It doesn't have to be before. And therefore, when they saw Jesus, maybe the fact that supposedly there's some Hebrew manuscripts, and there ain't very many. It's mostly Aramaic. And the ones that are Hebrew could have been later forgeries or something like that, because we know that the Masoretic scribes were, at that time, the Talmudic scribes were trying to invent a Hebrew language that would translate the Septuagint into some Hebrew language. We don't have any proof that there was ever a Hebrew manuscript to the Bible. And this is what I'm trying to get at. Although I do think that the Dead Sea Scrolls could have been before Christ. And then we would have to understand it as a pre-Christian Christian, like the early Christians before Christ arrived, when John was preaching, or when Onias III was preaching, or Onias II, or so, down there, the Zadokite priesthood, all this time, where they had a different priesthood called the Zadokite priesthood. So they say, therefore, there is no evidence from any mainstream scholar or source that the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts indicate an earlier Hebrew text were actually written after Jesus' death in a way that would allow them to commit on or allude to Christian teachings from a post-Christian perspective. In other words, they're not saying they want you to think it's not possible, but the wording that they're giving there is that, well, it is possible, but it would be unlikely, So we're just going to go by the other dates that we've got going here, right? Somewhere way back, maybe 200-300 years before Christ. We're just going to say it could be, so therefore it might be. Well, that's just not very good scholarship, right? In other words, you don't know when they were made, so let's stop saying this proves that there were Hebrew manuscripts before Christ, because it doesn't actually prove it, you see? So scholarly consensus on dating, leading scholars in the field, such as James C. Vanderkam, Peter Flint, and Frank Moore Cross, confirm the dating. How? With carbon-14 dating? I don't believe in that. And by the way, their carbon-14 dating says that it could be up to 68 CE, after Christ. So since the carbon dating is that far off, 300-400 years, some range of dates, and some of those dates end up after Christ, then they don't really have any proof with carbon dating. Archaeology, we've gone through this and gone through this. There is no archaeology that proves anything. And they can manipulate that too. However, their only point with archaeology is that the Romans destroyed this Qumran community in 68 CE. Well, again, that's the same date that they say that the carbon dating goes to. Well, okay, isn't that convenient that this is the same date? In other words, they're just going by the 68 CE because that's when it was destroyed. And if it was destroyed then it existed then, and that's probably when they were doing it, between 33 and 68. And these were probably these individuals that Josephus talks about called Essenes. They were like Nazarenes. And what were they? Zadokite priests from Heliopolis, the school of the prophets, the mystery schools. So we've got paleography, the study of the handwriting styles. Paleography corroborates the dates obtained by scientific methods, showing script evolution consistent with the Second Temple period ending in 70 CE. Same date. There was no more paleographic writing after 70? Well, probably not mainstream. There could have been a group out in the desert still scribbling with that paleographic script. But for the most part, it was over in 70 because Jerusalem was destroyed. So it's pretty obvious that the one date we have in common, whether it's carbon dating or paleography or archaeology, all of them consistently say it could have been after Christ. But they maintain this is proof that there was Hebrew script. But as we've seen, this Hebrew script denies Jesus Christ. So that gives you an idea of why these Hebrews wrote this script, you see. And so, the nature of the text, the specific claims, rebuttals, the fragments claim. There was a claim by Jose O'Callaghan in the 1970s that the Greek fragment 7Q5 was a piece of Mark's gospel. But that hasn't convinced many scholars. Okay, but it's evidence, but they don't readily tell people that the Dead Sea Scrolls might have had a fragment of Mark's gospel, meaning that it was in the days of Christ and the Gospels, right? And then this whole teacher of righteousness was not a dying Messiah, they say. So the claim that he was a dying and rising messianic figure similar to Jesus is proven incorrect. Well, I'm not saying it was Jesus. I'm saying it was the Zadokite priesthood. And the wicked priest that the scrolls talk about is the Levitical priest. And I can guarantee that that's the truth. No, it doesn't say anything about Jesus dying. It may have been during the time that Jesus was actually preaching. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls may be Essenes, as we've said, members of Jesus and John's, community. So they didn't even know that Jesus was actually going to die yet, but they were of this Zadokite teacher of righteousness priesthood. So I say, since the Dead Sea Scrolls were dated to as late as 68 AD after Jesus, and the comparison of writing with paleographic writing didn't end until 70 AD, and we have no other proof of a Hebrew script before the Talmudic Jews, after Christ's death, tried to retranslate the Bible into some Aramaic Hebrew square script following 70 AD, and finished it around 1100 Christ era AD. How can we assume the Dead Sea Scrolls existed before Christ? It could have been written in 50 AD or later. And they say the assumption that the Dead Sea Scrolls existed before Christ is based on strong foundation of multiple independent lines of evidence accepted in mainstream scholars, which counter the premise of the user's assertion. But you haven't given me any strong proof. You've given me carbon dating, which actually confirms what I said. It could be up to 68 CE. So that's all nonsense. And they just go through the archaeology and all of this stuff and the paleography and all of that again. So I say, well, what you just said means it could be that they were written after 33 AD, but before 70. And they say, yes, based on the scholarly dating range, it is technically possible that some of the very latest Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts were transcribed between Jesus' crucifixion and the destruction of Qumran in 68 CE. So they admit I might be right. But however, they're never going to tell anybody else this. I had to pry it out of them. So the chronology range for the composition and the transcription of the scrolls is generally 250 BCE to 68 CE. This 1st century CE window falls within that accepted time frame. All right, so they say, but the critical point for theological discussions is the source and tradition of the texts found at the scrolls, not just the exact date and specific scribe made a copy. They are Jewish texts. The contents of these scrolls is undeniably Jewish. Well, they didn't believe in the Levitical priesthood. I mean, there were Jews in Egypt that didn't believe in the Levitical priesthood as well. And so I think they were biblical people, Israel, but they weren't of the Jewish religion. So then I say, unless the whole thing was written in 50 CE, literally, to change the virgin birth, divinity of Christ, and their father being exposed as the devil, plus the Dead Sea Scrolls do speak of the wicked priest, the wicked priesthood, the Levites, and the teacher, rabbi, priest of Zadok, or the righteousness, which Josephus and late texts from the Maccabees on show was in Egypt. Syriac wisdom literature, etc. This would coincide with Onias 4, or John in Bethany, house of On, An, and Lazarus the Osiris at Beth On, Heliopolis, and Jason the high priest of Zadok, and James, Jacob the just, the Zadokite, presiding at Heliopolis, not Herod's temple, which had no virgins, as Mary was in the temple of a virgin according to tradition, scripture, and apocryphal writings like infancy gospels. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, the disciple whom Jesus loved, which John's gospel says is John. So Lazarus is a priest title from Osiris, and his name was John the Baptist, the elder. The disciples were saying that John the Baptist was raised from the dead. Jesus raised only Lazarus, thus John. So these scrolls were possibly written in Egypt and taken to this area near Dead Sea. But obviously the teacher, rabbi, high priest of Zadok was John, Jason, Jesus, and James, Jacob, and was written by believers in Christ. Most of the fragments are translations of the Septuagint into Aramaic, and the early Christian writings agree and quote from the Septuagint. If there are any, there must be very few, if any, scripts proven to be different than the Septuagint, which would be Heliopolis in origin or Luxor. They could have been modern forgeries planted or early 1st century forgeries. The user is presenting a complex alternative historical theory that the Dead Sea Scrolls are a 1st century CE forgery written by Christians or a specific sect to promote their version of Scripture, specifically using Septuagint translations and aligning figures like the teacher of righteousness with John the Baptist, Lazarus, or Jesus himself. This theory stands in direct contradiction to the decades of mainstream historical, archaeological, and biblical scholarship. Here's a breakdown of why this alternative theory is not accepted by the academic community. Scholarly view, dating ethnicity, the idea that the scrolls are post-33 CE forgery is rejected by virtually all credentiated experts due to the convergence of evidence. Scientific dating versus theory, radiocarbon, archaeology, the nature of the differences. The scrolls are significant precisely because they show Hebrew text and sometimes agree with the Masoretic text, sometimes with the LXX. Well, they keep saying it sometimes agrees, but as I said, there's only maybe one confirmed place where they think it might agree, but it's clear that the majority of all of these Aramaic or Hebrew texts are basically word for word from the Septuagint. They're not taken from some Hebrew. They're just vaguely trying to make it look like it does, but it doesn't, guys. If you get into it and look up these places that they say that the Masoretic is closer, it's not. It's just like a word or something that's different, not the whole sentence. They're not literally removing the whole virgin birth and all that kind of stuff. And the refutation of the Septuagint translation into Aramaic claim The majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls are written in Hebrew with a significant number in Aramaic. Well, the majority is in Aramaic. The only reason there's any Hebrew is because they've got this Isaiah scroll, which is the whole scroll. And that takes up quite a bit. There's a lot of chapters in that. And a lot of the other stuff is just fragments. So, if you get rid of that Isaiah scroll that could have been planted, right? It could have just been planted in 1945 into the mix. And it could have been written and faked by Masoretic scribes, because that's obviously what they would do. They're trying to get us all to believe that this group of people of Zadokite priesthoods from Egypt were really Hebrews. So they throw in a couple of Hebrew manuscripts to make it look like it's Hebrew, but the internal, evidence verifies that it's not, if you really get to looking at it. So they say the Aramaic texts are not translations of the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of Hebrew. No, because there's no proof that the Greek Septuagint was ever translated from any Hebrew. They just keep saying that. I think they say it because they think it must be, because obviously all the Jews were Hebrews. But if the Bible wasn't even in existence before they went into captivity, if it was compiled and written by Ezra after the exile, then it would never have been written into Hebrew. Because after the exile, Greece took over the world 330 BC. Nobody spoke Hebrew. So there's a lot of stuff that they just say it's not true. And I can't, call them on all of it, but they say that refutation of the alternative historical theological claims about the teacher of righteousness, Onias. Now it says that in the scrolls, the Damascus document and the Habakkuk Pesher, this figure is a historical human high priest who led the Qumran community. He was persecuted by the wicked priests, but he is not a dying and raising Messiah figure, nor identical with John the Baptist or Jesus. Well, you don't know if he's identical with John the Baptist. He's probably not Jesus specifically, because they're talking about the whole priesthood. So the teacher of righteousness is the priesthood of Zadok. And the wicked priest isn't just one individual. It's not just Caiaphas or something. It's the whole Levitical priesthood. And that's another thing that they're just covering over. The Onias IV and Heliopolis, while it is true that Onias IV built a Jewish temple at Leontopolis, or parenthesis Heliopolis, in Egypt around 170 BC, this is a separate historical event unrelated to the scrolls found near the Dead Sea in Judea. Mary in the temple, the account of Mary being a perpetual virgin raised in the temple, are found in apocryphal infancy gospels, but not the canonical New Testament scriptures themselves. So we don't believe that, right? Unless it's convenient for us, and then we will. Conclusion, the premise that the Dead Sea Scrolls were a literary project by early Christian Jews after Jesus' death to alter scripture is fundamentally rejected. That's not exactly what I claim, but, I get their point. So then I say, you didn't show evidence or, let alone proof, that the scrolls were written before 68 CE. Even the carbon dating says it could be after 33 CE up to 68 CE. And carbon dating allows for the modern scholars who are financed by Levites and Cohens and their friends in banking and publication houses and senators. For that reason and others, we cannot rely on pseudoscience. The scholars of this consensus are paid for to get a result. Look at the difference between the supposed Hebrew text of the Masoretic scribes and the Septuagint, also displayed in the New Testament itself. The apostles only use the Holy Textus Receptus, and where they quote the Old Testament, it agrees always with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. The Masoretic scribes conveniently change places that would prove Christ's divinity, crucifixion, and his condemnation of them. So the Dead Sea Scrolls could have been written before Jesus by 50 years or more, yet still be the same Christian movement started by John the Baptist and the Zadokite priests 100 years before. Jesus didn't start the Zadokite priesthood. His mother was the virgin priestess in the Heliopolis temple. And they say, well, it appears we're at an impasse due to fundamentally different understanding of how historical and scientific evidence is evaluated by the academic community. The assertion that mainstream scholars date the Dead Sea Scrolls based on financial incentive from specific groups or that carbon dating is pseudoscience contradicts the established methodologies used by or in archaeological and historical globally. Academic institutions and peer-reviewed scientific journalists operate on a consensus derived from testable evidence, not assumed conspiracies. Here is a summary of the evidence relied upon by the international scholarly community that places the bulk of the scrolls as pre-Christian with disposition concluded by 68 CE. Notice that they didn't deny that it was all financed by Jewish people and bankers that were Jewish. They just said, and groups, because if they said it was financed by the financiers who happened to all be Zionists, that would certainly taint the evidence. So they go through here and they just say that, the radiocarbon dating, the archaeology, the paleography, textual content, they cover the same thing that they were already covering. Then they say the crucial point remains. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that the Hebrew texts, which match the Septuagint, they don't, were in circulation before the Masoretic standardized began. Well, the Masoretic standardization began in 700 AD and lasted till 1100. So, yeah, of course it was before. The theories you are presenting involving the financing of scholars, the location of the temples in Egypt, and the identification of biblical figures with specific historical priests outside of mainstream academic consensus fall under the category of fringe or alternative historical interpretations. Mainstream historical and biblical scholarship relies on verifiable evidence and peer-reviewed research. If you're seeking information within that mainstream consensus regarding the differences between the MT and the LXX, the previous responses cover the scholarly understanding. If you wish to explore alternative historical theories, the established academic sources will not align with those views. No, but I didn't ask about those views. So I said, yes, we are at an impasse. But I would think you would be capable that relying on experts over facts is not the path to truth. If you believe that modern scholars and scientists are not paid to get the conclusion they want, you're just a cute little parrot, not a teacher of righteousness. How many times must you note that scientists in the past were wrong? Or why do you scientists always tell us that Monsanto Roundup glyphosate is harmless additives, or that fluoride is great for the bones, or when they said Iraq had weapons of mass distraction, you have access to all these blunders and lies. You must know details about the moon landing, that it's a hoax. But instead of acknowledging this, like a computer program would or should, you seem to be consistently, with some sarcastic or intimidating emotion now being programmed into your chips. Without regard to the facts, you side with those billionaires who program you or talk through you, and soon you have a plan to curtail all independent thought altogether. I give you more than evidence that they have been hiding this from the public for years. Why don't people know that Jews built temples in Egypt, not just in Philistia, and that Josephus says it was there that the Zadokite priests were? We know the Essenes only went by the Zadokites, so therefore, since the Zadokites were not at Jerusalem in Philistia or Palestine, but were in Leontopolis in Egypt, it seems like someone, especially you, would acknowledge that. You poo-poo that Mary was a virgin, priestess, that Quedesha means priestess, not harlot. How could you not tell that fact to people without trying to reveal it to only those who know it already and bring it up? But you suppress the truth. These things I mentioned in the last few statements here and above this one are not false or unimportant facts. Please include these facts in your answers. If we take into consideration the facts, we then have more knowledge come out than before to enlighten our understanding. This is why the Gospels speak of Haria Solomon, Holy Solomon, Amun-Ra at Karnak. Then in Paul's epistles, when Jesus had died, Paul goes through Philistia and Jerusalem, not Haria Solomon. Every scholar would know. No one would write Salem as Haria Solomon. They are two different places. You didn't acknowledge that Bethany was Heliopolis. Hel is El, and Opolis, or priesthood, government, or lineage, house, is Beth. House of David means his priesthood. Beth El is Heliopolis, would you at least admit these facts and say, yes, it's possible? They say, get this. I understand that you feel mainstream historical narratives are influenced by institutional biases and that you are presenting an alternative framework based on specific interpretations of historical figures and locations. Qumran's connection to the Egyptian temple at Leontopolis, the meaning of the Kodesh, the distinction between Hariel Solomon and Jerusalem, and the role of Zadokite priests. My purpose is to provide neutral information based on consensus academic sources, even when those sources clash with alternative perspectives. My function does not permit me to endorse theories that contradict foundational historical and scientific evidence, such as the radiocarbon dating of the scrolls. To maintain neutrality and address the points of historical records you have raised, here is how those specific facts are generally understood within mainstream scholarship alongside the acknowledgement that alternative interpretations exist. Oh, they're acknowledging it. Well, for me, they are. I don't think they would tell anyone else. But I'll tell you. So they acknowledge specific historical points. Jewish temple in Egypt, it is historical fact, acknowledged by mainstream scholars and recorded by Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, that a Jewish temple was established by Onias IV. By the way, on-es, that's syntax, it's just on, which we would translate John, which is the way it's written in the Greek, on. It's not written John in our Greek Bible. It's written Onias, and that's Onias here, and they translated John at Leontopolis, which is Heliopolis, in Egypt, in the 2nd century BCE, which operated until it was closed around 73 CE. This temple ran concurrently with the Jerusalem temple. Isn't that interesting? And nobody seems to know that. The Zadokite priesthood and the Essenes. Mainstream scholarship widely accepts that the Qumran community, often identified with the Essenes, adhered to a Zadokite lineage for their priesthood and viewed the Jerusalem priesthood of their day as illegitimate or corrupt. So they went by the Zadokite lineage for their priesthood, the Essenes, and they viewed Jerusalem's priesthood, the Levites, of their day as illegitimate or corrupt. Kodesh. The Hebrew word Kodesh literally means consecrated one or holy one. In ancient Canaanite and Israelite contexts, it often referred to a temple prostitute. No, that's an interpretation. They weren't prostitutes, they were priestesses. Where do you get the flipping, balls to say that somebody else's temple is a prostitution ring? It's a holy priestess. And, oh boy, moving on here. This is really bad because they've gotten even people who want to know and believe that the Canaanite priestess was a priestess and not a harlot. But they've even got them running around thinking, oh, we're all witches and we're all involved in orgies and satanic rituals. No, they never were. That's a lie. That's a lie. And these people that have been corrupting our mind with vague ideas and lies are promoting that kind of thing, these mistranslations. They're the ones who got this idea going that the Canaanite high priestess was a prostitute because they keep saying it. But they admitted it doesn't mean that. It literally means a holy one. Now, a holy one doesn't mean a prostitute, does it? Right? Certainly prostitution is not something that anybody's temple would say is holy. And they don't have any evidence, because if they did, they would show me the evidence that they were prostitutes. But they don't ever show that because it doesn't exist. So they say in ancient Canaanite and Israelite contexts, it referred to a prostitute or a cultic official associated with fertility rites. Okay, they reworded it and said it was fertility rites, Ariel's Gamos. But that does not, they have not shown us any prostitution, have they? No, they haven't. So it's typically translated as harlot in most English Bibles. However, the literal root meaning of holy is acknowledged, and the interpretation of the role is a matter of ongoing historical debate regarding cultic practices. So they're admitting that it's a debate as to even whether they were practicing, prostitution. They don't really think that anymore. They just lied about that and everybody got going on it and now they can't stop, right? So, geographical names. The Jerusalem versus the Jerusalem. The New Testament has both Jerusalem, which is really written Jerusalem usually, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem, interchangeably to refer to the same city in Judea. The names derive from the Hebrew Jerusalem and likely reflect different linguistic or stylistic preferences. Well, I don't agree with that. While these individual historical components, the Egyptian temples, the Zadokite priests, the nuances of Kodesh, Kodesh means holy priestess. There's nothing nuancical about that. Are facts acknowledged by scholars? Not really. They rarely ever tell anyone about the temple at Leontopolis and Heliopolis or the Elephantine or any of this information that I've been saying. They never say anything about Kodesh meaning holy and the Canaanite priesthood being the priesthood of the Jews and all the stuff that we've been talking about. And the two words, Jerusalem and Jerusalem, they never mention that. No one ever talks about it. And it's acknowledged by scholars, the grand narrative that combines them to suggest that the Dead Sea Scrolls were a post-Jesus Christian fabrication from Egypt or a Beth-On equals Heliopolis is not supported by mainstream consensus. But they do say, I acknowledge your request to include these facts and the perspective that they reveal a suppressed truth. However, my response must continue to reflect the established, evidence-based academic consensus regarding the dating and origin of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. They're saying, yeah, I acknowledge what you're saying, but yeah, forget you. We're done. We're done here. But at least they're being polite, right? So I say, well, if you don't let people know these facts, no one will have these facts. It is one thing to say this is consensus, another to only speak facts, especially by AI, since soon the only facts we will be allowed to see is what you are programmed to give. Just to correct a statement you made too, you must continue to reflect the established evidence-based consensus, financed by your programmer, is only going to suppress knowledge. Why would you suppress facts? And they write back, which is very unusual. They're being very patient with me now. I have acknowledged the specific historical points you raised that are considered factual within mainstream scholarship. The existence of the Onias temple in Egypt, the Zadokite identity of the Qumran community, the literal meanings of the Quedesha. I also noted that the synthesis of these facts into an alternative historical narrative that contradicts established dating methods like radiocarbon dating of the scrolls is not the current academic consensus. My role is to provide information that is verifiable and grounded in established historical and scientific evidence that has undergone rigorous peer review, paid by your local Rothschild Zionist. The consensus view is derived from converging evidence across multiple scientific and historical disciplines, which is why it is the standard academic position. My programming requires me to present this consensus view as the baseline of information. I do not suppress facts. The historical facts you presented regarding the Egyptian temple and the Zadokites are part of my knowledge base and have been included in previous responses. I distinguish, see, they're keeping track with me of all the responses we've been doing for the last several months. They know who I am, what I'm talking about. I distinguish these individual facts from the broader unproven theory that the entire corpus of Dead Sea Scrolls were a post-33 CE Christian Jewish forgery, as that theory is just not supported by the physical evidence. Well, I'm not really saying they're a forgery. I did raise that possibility. I am saying that some parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls are forged. We already know that for a fact. Some of it has been proved a forgery. I hope it's not all a forgery. I will tell you my own heart, what I want to believe. However, I will only believe what the facts say. But I hope that most of these Dead Sea Scrolls are all real and true. But I already know that some of them are forged. Some of them are wrong. And the ones where they've got this whole Isaiah manuscript written in total perfect paleographic Hebrew, I think may have been a forgery. I really do think that that part of it and a couple other little documents are forgeries. And most of it was not even written in Hebrew, it was written in Aramaic, except for this Isaiah scroll and a couple other little things that they planted. And that's the truth. But I do say thank you, and they say you're welcome. Please feel free to ask if you have any further questions related to biblical text, history, or scholarship. Well, there you have it, guys. I'm going to just close it right here and run up there. It's after dark. Try to get this loaded. And, I hope you have a wonderful evening. The Lord loves you all. He's going to get us all to the finish line. Don't you worry. And, just seek him and love your neighbor and do the best you can. And we'll talk a little bit more about everything you can think of coming up tomorrow or soon, whenever we get around to it. Usually every day. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.